Hey, hi, good evening. My name is Kim Crosby. I'm the interim director of the Harris Center Regional Policy and Development. So it's a great pleasure to be here today to officially welcome you to this really important discussion on community planning for the future. To start with the land acknowledgement, we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. For housekeeping, should we need to leave for an emergency, to the left are the stairs that will bring us out, or we just go to the right and continue out the way we came into the main doors. Washrooms as well are located to the right at the end of the corridor. This evening's presentation is being live streamed and recorded, so please hold all questions until the end. And when we start the Q&A portion of it, wait until you have a microphone in your hand before asking the question, and that's so that everyone that's viewing online will be able to hear the conversation and the discussion. So this is the final session of the spring series, and this is part of a series that we've offered in partnership with the Political Science Department and their new Law and Public Policy program. Tonight's presentation will focus on future planning and the challenges for communities in approaching longer-term planning. We're very happy to have the opportunity to hear from a long-standing colleague of the Harris Center, who has also been sitting within our office space for the last several months. He's also Signal Hill Campus's academic in residence, Dr. Richard Sherber. After 5, we get to say a little bit about you first. There we go. After 5 years as a real estate consultant in Paris and 13 years as professor at the University of Quebec, Richard is currently professor at the McGill School of Urban Planning, which he directed until he went on sabbatical in July 2023, and he joined us here. His research focuses on regional development, particularly in peripheral areas, and on the location of the economic activity. He has recently published on innovation processes, both within small and medium-sized enterprises and within municipalities, with articles in the Journal of Economic Geography, Regional Studies, and Urban Affairs Review. He is also, in his spare time, apparently, a registered professional planner.
Right.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim. Right, well, I'm delighted to be here this evening to talk to you about future planning for communities. Now, I know that there's a lot of information out there, a lot of exercises happening, and that's not really what I'm going to focus on tonight. I'm going to try and focus on how we can actually think about the future. And I'll only touch down towards the end on some of the practical ways of doing it. But even then, I will stay at a sort of a more, maybe not so much academic, but a more conceptual level. Because my impression is that there's quite a lot of practice, but actually is drawing back and trying to understand how that practice fits in to a conceptual framework that could be helpful. So that's really what I'm aiming to do this evening. I'm also aiming to make this go forward.
Hang on, I'm gonna screen share first.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
That would be a good.
Yeah, we'll make sure everyone else can see it too. Yeah. Oh, it's up here. All right, we're getting there.
Good.
And where did the presentation vote is hidden? It's down here too.
Do that. There you go.
Thank you. Between the two of us, we'll figure it out.
Right.
All right, you're good.
Okay, thank you very much. So when I first started thinking about future thinking, this is really what I thought it was. I mean, had you spoken to me about 2 or 3 years ago and about futurism, about future thinking, about futurology and all these things, I thought, right, crystal ball gazing, this is ridiculous. It can't be done. At best, it's science fiction like this, or it's just sort of gazing into the future. But then I realized that we all tell the future. For instance, I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to tell you about the content of what you are going to hear over the next few minutes. This is indeed part of the future, which we're going to reveal quite soon. So I'm going to introduce what I'm talking about. I'm going to try and explain my motivations and then briefly go over some broad examples of what I call visionary planning and how that was rejected. And there's a historical aspect to this and our current sort of participatory turn, and then I'll try and sum all that up. I will then land on a couple of questions to be addressed, which are really, how can we think about the future? How can we integrate that into our thinking? And questions of causation, because if we are planning for the future, we have to think about what the causal directions are. In particular, and I'll come back to this, of course, is to what extent does the future cause what's happening now? And I found that really interesting to start thinking about, and I think it's very relevant from a policy perspective. Because if we begin to accept that what the future holds can actually influence what we're talking, decisions made now, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that as I go along, then actually policy and visioning and scenario building begins to make some sense. I'll briefly touch upon why communities, by which I mean small, often territorialized groups of people, actually have to approach this in a particular way, but also have some advantages in terms of the broader society in thinking about the future. There are also some limitations, of course. And then I will go more specifically into two approaches, which are fairly well known to community practitioners, one which is sort of visioning and one which is scenario building. I'll go into those in some detail for those of you who maybe don't know exactly what I'm talking about. And then I'll try and tie that in with some of the more theoretical ideas that I presented earlier on about the past, future, and causation, because both actually do take rather different views of how we can begin thinking about the future. And I must say, I have come to this over quite a lengthy period of reading. When I first came across them, I couldn't really work out what the difference was. And so I'll share with you the difference that I think I've identified, and then I'll tie it all up. Okay, so why this talk and why me? Well, there are sort of three basic reasons. One of them is sort of a personal and professional reason. I mean, many years ago, I did a lot of work in peripheral regions, going to mining communities, and I was struck by, even though you could see the future coming, you knew the mine was going to close, and often you knew it was going to close in a few years' time. In one community in particular that I remember, we just knew it was going to close. It was impossible to get any action to happen. Basically, each of the sort of community leaders said, well, you know, we're sort of making good money now. Yes, we know something needs to be done, but we're not going to do it yet. And the question was, when are you going to do it? And the answer, the implicit answer was, well, when disaster strikes, and then we'll move. So it didn't really dawn on me then, but thinking back, I realized that was a sort of circumstance where really a bit of future thinking would have done a lot of help. Then, as Kim mentioned, I joined the School of Urban Planning. So I've been involved in the urban planning world for the last 10 years. I became a professional planner over that period of time. And what has really struck me, much to my annoyance, is that a huge amount of planning is to do with permits, is to do with zoning, is to do with local squabbles, and very little is to do with really thinking about where the future of cities or communities is going to head. And in a way, this is what's motivating me in preparing, because all this reading has been to prepare a course to try and get my students to get their nose out of the ground and to think of some of the broader picture when they are doing urban planning. So that's my personal motivations and professional motivations. Then, of course, like everybody, I read the press. And when I read the press, I get bombarded with articles about the future of work, the future of offices, the future of Beyonce, the future of democracy, the future of everything has its article almost weekly in the press. And it's worthwhile then sort of taking a step back and say, okay, well, you know, what is the future? Everybody's talking about it. How can we actually think about it constructively? And then finally, my pet irritation are the techno-determinists. And we are bombarded with techno-determinists. In this building, we have quite a large contingent, but they really emanate from California, where this idea is, from my perspective, being rammed down our throats that there is no alternative, that the future is technological, and we should just shut up and go with it. Something I find rather hard to accept, but then you have to think it through, because technology is shaping to some extent where we're heading. So how can we actually separate out sort of a part of that story, which is obviously referring to one aspect of the world around us, and the sort of intense irritation that it sort of elicits, because after all, it does take away any agency. So those are my motivations for talking about the future and future planning. So far from what I have sort of seen in the press and my students and from coming out from California is a lot of short-termism on the one hand. On the other hand, a cacophony of futures. There are so many futures, one can't think about it because there are so many of them, and there is little or no shared vision. These multiple futures seem to be in competition with one another. There is no broader vision, and we can debate, and we will think about whether that's actually a good thing or not. So I'm not sure what's showing on the, okay. So we have that short-termism, the cacophony, the competing futures. We also have a large set of gloomy predictions about climate, climate change, warming, about demography, aging, about the end of work. And so I would say that the first sort of set of items I grouped together under sort of postmodernism, the cacophony, all voices are equal, we sort of don't know really what's being said. And then we have the gloomy predictions, which are actually quite deterministic. They are really, it's sort of a neo-modernism, which I call gloomy modernism, where we have gone from the modernism where everything was getting better, there was progress, to postmodernism, where we didn't know what was happening. And now at least some of our future stories are gloomy. We do know where it's heading, and it's heading down. So this is really the situation as I saw it or see it, but I'm trying to make some sense of it all. So it hasn't always been so. There hasn't always been a cacophony of futures, and there haven't always been gloomy. So here are a few examples of vision. I'm not using visionary in a qualitative sense. I'm just saying these views of the future had a vision, and then we can debate whether it was a good vision or not. This is Broadacre City. This is Frank Lloyd Wright, who viewed sort of the future of cities as massive towers housing 100,000 people. That's that big spike in the distance, surrounded by endless suburbia, and linked together by cars and highways. So this was a vision, and I'm mentioning Frank Lloyd Wright, but we had Le Corbusier, who had sort of similar visions. Ebenezer Howard, who was far more focused on sort of green space and low-rise buildings, still had a rather deterministic vision of how cities should be planned. And then that's then transferred over to planners like Robert Moses, a notorious New York planner who sort of had basically governed New York planning for about 30 years. This sort of technocratic approach to planning, but it had a vision. Then you have a sort of the Versailles. There's a number of French examples here, because that's where I grew up. Versailles, the sort of it's very regimented. It was planned to sort of show everybody how important the king was, and it's linked to sort of religious power as well. But this was a planning used to sort of put forward some symbols of power. Then on the right, you have Haussmann's Paris. So Paris was a very medieval city with lots of warren of small streets. And Haussmann came along and said, look, we need to suppress revolutions. So he built these sorts of boulevards that sort of just knocked straight through large sections of Paris. This is an example of military planning. Military planning goes back to Greece, where when sort of the Greece was expanding, had to quickly build settlements in its sort of colonies, and it used a grid system. The Romans did that, and so the military planning has also been very important. But it had a vision of conquering and of defense. Again, I'm not judging these visions. I'm just saying there was a vision, and it translated into specific plans. Again, more recently, this is a 1970s map of Paris, and by now we've gone away from sort of individual planners to sort of groups of technocrats, but there's still technocrats drawing big lines over the maps of Paris, say this is where we're going to build new towns, this is where the axes along which people are going to travel. And this, in a way, was the apogee of technocratic planning, because in the 1970s, and it's been building up since then, there had also been some resistance to it. But before I leave the visionaries, it's not just in France. The Federal Highway Act in 1956. I mean, they planned 65,000 miles of highway. I mean, talk about a vision. We may now regret that vision, but it was still visionary. There was in England, Beveridge and his ilk sort of had a vision of actually implementing a welfare society. And so in 1942, they brought out what's known as the Beveridge Report, which actually detailed how they were going to have a universal health system, unemployment benefits, parental leave, and they implemented it as well over the next sort of 20 years or so before it began to be unpicked. And on a sort of slightly smaller scale, but one which is well known, is a famous race to the moon. Kennedy in 1962 said by the end of the decade, we'll have men on the moon, and I use the word men advisedly. And indeed, that vision came true. So visionary planning, I know this is not the community scale, but you get the idea. However, this didn't last. The idea of the technocrat, the visionary planner, was being undermined, had been being undermined for a long time. I mean, those of you who have read Kropotkin and about the anarchists will know that there's always been some resistance, but that resistance really came into its own in the 1960s, where you had the women's movement really began to make dents in the patriarchy. You had the anti-colonial or decolonizing movements. You had the hippies, who were also sort of anarchic. And in fact, the current sort of California ideology could be traced back to the sort of anti-authoritarian hippies, some of whom moved into Silicon Valley and started building computers and telling us what to do. So there's a bit of irony there. And of course, there was the anti-war movement as well. And all of these sort of various movements were setting themselves up against this sort of technocratic, centralized view of planning. And the other reason for this sort of unpicking, if you will, of the technocratic planning was that it was no longer delivering. Here you see the sort of rise in inequalities as a lot of the wealth being created was distributed evenly amongst sort of different levels of earning until about the 1980s. And since then, it has begun to sort of the inequalities that we know today have begun to rise. And that too is a reason why sort of the centralized sort of planning which brought us up to the 1970s and early 80s began to be critiqued. And it's led to this sort of view of planning. You have in the yellow building, you have the technocrats who know what the villagers want, but the villagers down around the table saying, no, you should be talking to us. And the big questions are, so who has been articulating future visions? And in most of the examples I gave you, they were white European men. And for whom are these visions being articulated? And these questions are really very important and have come to the fore really with all these critiques of the sort of visionary, future-oriented planning. So I'm cutting a long story short, but now we have got to the situation where we no longer have visionary, forward-looking planning. We often have a mantra of participation. Now, participation in and of itself is an excellent thing, provided that it also involves planning and looking into the future. But there are many issues with participation. And those issues are issues, some of which are reminiscent actually of more centralized planning. Who is participating? I mean, we may know who planned the moonshot, but even in these participatory processes, the question is who is actually participating? Which groups are there? Which people are there? Which individuals are there? Who is actually expressing themselves? Who is being listened to? So in a way, this participatory term has not really solved that particular issue about really policy making and planning for the future. There are power dynamics. I mentioned that a lot of the plans that I have evoked, a lot of the visionary planning I evoked was sort of European or white men of European extraction. But there are power dynamics happening in participatory contexts as well. And these are increasingly being talked about, and there is no easy way around that. Power dynamics are part of society, really. One of the things about participatory processes, and this is one of the items which I have noticed, at least in urban planning, but also in the example of economic development that I mentioned sort of early on in the talk, is that there is still a sort of short-termism and focus on minor issues. It's often easier to sort of squabble over those. People, they walk out in the street, they see something they don't like, they come back in and they participate. To even get people or these groups to think about longer term is actually rather difficult. It's as I'll mention later on, it's actually a real skill to get groups of people, communities, to think beyond the short term. And also, I mentioned the cacophony of futures. There are many irreconcilable visions, even within the groups who participate. You get these sort of right-wing libertarians who have a sort of an Ayn Randian view. You get the climate pessimists. You now have, one of the critiques of futurism, and quite justifiable, up until the sort of 80s or 90s, was that it was mainly written by European white men. Okay, but now we have a huge number of futurisms, all of which is clamoring for a spot in the sun, which doesn't really help us either. In terms of actually plotting our future, thinking through the future. So these variety of views have sort of come to the fore through participation, but we still haven't got much closer to a way of planning the future that is not centralized or the vision of one or small group of people. We just have done away with the idea of vision totally. Totally is maybe an exaggeration, but we seem to have done away with the idea of vision because it may well be, and this is something that I haven't resolved yet, it may well be that visions can only be the vision of one group or small group of people. Is it possible to even have a vision from a large group of people? We'll sort of talk about that a little bit in the future. I quite like the cartoon there, which is one solution, is that you can have a city for people who like cars, a city for people who don't. That's one way of solving the problem, but it's hardly a vision. Anyway, that's the sort of overall situation, which sort of brought me to a lot of the reading I've been doing over the last year or so. So is it possible to think constructively about the future? And also, can it be of any use? I mean, it's all very well to think about the future, but can it have any impact? And this is where it's useful to take a step back and think about what we mean by the future, what we mean by time, and also what we mean by having an impact. In other words, causation. And I know that this is straying into maybe slightly more esoteric territory, but I found it really useful to think this through. So, what is the future? A sort of a classic, common, and almost implicit view of the future is that it's linear. We have a past behind us, we have a future ahead of us, and indeed, I won't go into detail, but some cultures will reverse that. We say actually the future is behind us because we can't see it. But let's just take our current accepted view. The future is ahead, the past is behind. And that linear view was referred to previously in that little slide, which had sort of a modernism. It can be a view of an expanding future of progress, which has been current from, I would say, the early 18th century till about the end of the 20th century. It can also be actually a view of decline. The Renaissance, which we now see as a period of great artistic creation, at that time, the view of the future was linear, but one of decline. Why was it a decline? Because the great work was done by the Romans and the Greeks, and anything done in the 14th century was necessarily inferior. So the Renaissance thinkers and artists viewed progress as a slow decline. So yes, we can have a linear view of time, but it doesn't necessarily imply progress, and there are examples in the past of a linear view with decline. Still, I would say this is the most common, and in a lot of, when I teach my students statistical analysis, I say, look, causation runs from the past to the future. So you have a set of variables from the past, say from the, typically when we use census data, we take the situation in 1970, we run it forward sort of 20 years, and we say whatever the variables were in 1970 caused, in inverted commas, what we see in the 1980 or 1990. Very rarely or I would not get published if I said I would take the 1990 variables and predict what happened in 1970. So anyway, this is very standard. Another view is a cyclical view of time. Now, very often we associate this with more traditional societies, with maybe the feudal system, where everything was seasonal, where basically, the cycle of life and death repeated itself, and that's fair enough. But there was a huge amount of cyclical thinking in our own society. I mean, the end of the month is when taxes are due. Taxes come every year. It's a seasonal thing. Weekends, they occur every week. It's a cycle, a weekly cycle. So we may, and it's true that our overall view tends to be linear, but cyclical thinking is actually remarkably present when we actually, in our current way of viewing time, when we think about it. Now, what is more mind-bending, it's taken me some time to get my mind around it, is this view of time, where basically you have the present, which is at the sort of where the two crosses, and you have the future and the past, which are basically equivalent. And now that, when I first came across that idea, it took me some time to sort of get my mind around it. Now, this particular picture is actually from an article on quantum physics, and I'm not talking about quantum physics this evening. I won't even be able to say anything coherent about it, except for the fact that the view of time, which is now emerging from advanced physics, is actually very useful for us as we think about future thinking and communities. And I'm going to try to explain why I think it is useful. So we'll get back to that. Just to sort of begin, we know, and this is fairly well accepted, that the present constrains the future. So what we have now constrains the future. This is, when I say constrains, it constrains, it has a causal effect. The past causes the future in some way. And there are many examples, very prosaic. I mean, the accounting and valuation rules. If you're going to own a house in the future, it depends on current accounting rules. The way that we value the environment depends on the depreciation rate. How do we depreciate environmental services, for want of a better word? So really what happens in the future depends a lot on accounting rules, on valuation rules. The current structure of property ownership, unless there is a radical revolution, is going to have a major impact on the future over the next century or so. We see the large fortunes amassed at the end of the 19th century are still having a big impact today. I mean, think of Rockefeller, Carnegie Institute and things like that. So, the current property ownership has a massive impact. The physical environments and buildings. I mean, yes, we can destroy buildings, we can build them again, but Water Street was Water Street in the 18th century and is still Water Street today. A lot of the way our physical environment is sort of laid out actually remains with us for a long time. Those of you who've read Victor Hugo's Notre Dame of Paris, he has Quasimodo looking over Paris from the top of the cathedral. This is in the 14th century, tracing a number of roads that you can walk down today. So our physical environment has a major impact on the future. Culture, a lot of cultural norms are very difficult to displace. I recently read Mary Wollstonecraft and her very vigorous argumentation. It was an argument, not a plea, argument of why women should be treated in a more similar fashion to men, written in 1780s. Yet it took 250, 300 years, or 250 years at least, for that to even begin to have an impact. Why? Because she was fighting against totally ingrained cultural norms. Birth rates, demography. We know it doesn't necessarily have an impact over 250 years, but we know a lot about demography and population structure over the next 20, 30 or 40 years. And that is going to constrain the future. And of course, climate warming, chemicals in the air, resource depletion can also are occurring today, and we can project those and we know about the future. So that the past causes inverted commas the future is pretty straightforward. But the future can influence the present or can cause, again, causality. I'm using these different words. They're subtly different, but they're often amalgamated under the sort of overall word causation. How can the future influence the present? Well, I spoke about Mary Wilson. This must be an old version, so I corrected the spelling of her name. Obviously, I've put the wrong version here. My apologies. Mary Wollstonecraft's name has been misspelled. Anyway, she had hopes for the future. She reasoned about the place of woman. And ultimately, it did reverberate down the ages. It was picked up by a number of thinkers in the late 19th century, and it was picked up again by the suffragettes. And so, because these hopes were clearly articulated, one could argue that the vision of the future actually influenced what people did. And it ended up changing the future. It took some time, but it did. On a shorter time frame and with more obvious power, so Kennedy's belief that a moonshot was possible and necessary, I mean, his plus his administration's, actually made it possible. So it was this vision, this view of the future, what they believed was possible in the future, then affected what happened in the past or in their present. Today, we have a lot of predictions, and they are predictions. They're not hopes, they're not beliefs. For climate and aging, because we have good models and we can substantiate these predictions, this is why I'm using a different word here. These are indeed predictions, surrounded by probabilities, but they are predictions, which is not the same as a vision or hope. These predictions, though, are also going to impact the future. And the funny thing about these predictions is that we hope that they're wrong. We know that they're right now, but if we act upon them, they will be wrong and we will be relieved. Again, this is an example of the future, what we know will happen in the future, surrounded by margins of error. If we don't do anything, is hopefully going to impact what we do today. So the vision of the future, where society, communities, individuals think the future is headed, if they believe it strongly enough and argue it strongly enough and then act upon it, will actually alter the outcomes. And in this sense, you could say that the future, or at least the hopes and expectations about the future, influence the present. So from this perspective, the past and the present aren't entirely identical, but they're more identical than you think, or they're more similar than you think, and I will then explain a little bit why. You have the present and the future. Okay? A classic uncontroversial statement is that our actions today create, cause the future. I've just tried to explain why what we think the future is going to be can actually influence our decisions today. So in a way, there is a loop, and we can choose where to enter that loop, but this is one way of sort of thinking about it. But then there's the past. What about the past? Remember that quantum physics, where we have the past equivalent to the future? So I'm going to try and put forward the argument that actually the past is not so dissimilar to the future. So we have the past. We retell, I said the future again, I'm sorry, this is not the correct one. We retell the past as it suits us. So I've been reading a history of Newfoundland recently, and I was fascinated to discover that nobody really knows where John Cabot landed. Now, of course, Bonavista argues strongly. The story it tells is he landed in Bonavista. I've also heard stories that he landed in St. John's. And these stories are told by different people. I mean, the mayor of Bonavista, I assume, is a strong sort of supporter of the view that Cabot landed there. And there may be some pubs or some people who think that John Cabot should have landed in St. John's. So we're telling the past, and I apologize for this mistake, we're retelling the past as it suits us. Now, depending on what we say about the past, that's going to fashion the present. So Bonavista's sort of tourism policies or plans are dependent upon the stories they tell about the past. So now we actually begin to see why the past and the future can actually be deemed as somewhat equivalent. And then you say, okay, but we know what happened in the past. Right, there are material realities and constraints, and these are important, but they work both ways. There are material constraints about the future. So these climate models are taking into account very real material constraints about the future. We have modeled, or we, I speak, it's they, the scientists who are involved in climate studies, have modeled the future, and these constraints are well understood. So that's a material constraint on the future. So whatever our vision, I mean, we can have a vision to change it, but right now, that's what's going to happen. And I would say climate change over the next 30 or 40 or 50 years is pretty much dialed in. It's the longer term which we may be able to have an impact. So we have material, the future, the fact that the climate is going to be warmer in the future is a material reality about the future. There's also material realities about the present. I've mentioned those, property ownership, the current levels of CO2 and things like that. So we have material constraints about in the present that determine the future, but there are some material constraints about the future, property ownership, CO2 levels, which actually have an impact today. So the material constraints are not just today's materiality affecting the future. There is some materiality of the future that is going to affect today. And it's the same about the past. So of course, past materiality affects what we tell about the past. So for example, if tomorrow the mayor of Bonavista Vista finds some proof or a log from John Cabot's sort of boat showing that he landed there, then fine. That would be a material artifact from the past, which would sort of solve that. And so whatever stories we tell, we would have a material way of determining whether that story is correct or not. However, maybe finding that log requires materiality of the present. Maybe the technology we have so far can't sort of find that logbook, but we have some wonderful X-ray that can see 3 meters underground and under the sand, and we can find that logbook thanks to current materiality. So in other words, what we have in the present may actually then help us discover material facts about the past. So again, even these material constraints work in both directions. Now, I know that this is sort of maybe a bit mind-bending, and it certainly took me some time to work my way through all of this. And I'm condensing in a few minutes a lot of things that I've been thinking about for some time. But the fact that we are not necessarily living in a simple linear sort of time frame, that actually the stories we tell about the future, but also what we do for two things. We do know some things about the future that may or may not affect what we do now. And also we can tell some stories about the things we don't know about the future that may or may not affect things or decisions or actions that we take today. So we cannot ignore the material constraints, but we cannot ignore the importance of the visions and the stories that we tell, both about the past and about the future. And in fact, we could then widen this discussion and say, well, to what extent do the stories we tell about the past influence the future? I mean, there's some leapfrogging here. I put the present there, but actually it's, a lot of discussion can be had, and I'll sort of stop there on this. Right, so what about communities? So there's this sort of idea of planning, which is thinking about the future and possibly creating visions and building the future. So of course, communities are small scale. So the material and systemic realities and constraints affect them probably more so than they affect larger entities. So there are some major constraints on communities. There's no way that a community in and of itself, I mean, a community may know about climate change, but it's not going to be able to do anything about climate change, not by itself, that's for sure. So there needs to be an understanding of realities and constraints. And I say material, but also systemic. I mean, the governance system, the division of powers, so there are a whole bunch of things that communities just need to know about their situation. However, within those constraints, they also have considerable autonomy because they operate below the radar. They often do have a lot of autonomy in terms of day-to-day things, in terms of how they self-organize. I mean, yes, there are some constraints, but there are also many things that communities can do which provincial or federal governments don't care one way or the other. Not everything is regimented. And I think that there's a lot more that isn't regimented than we sort of often suspect. The other thing, I mentioned the challenges of participatory planning and participatory democracy. The good thing about, or the advantage that communities have, particularly smaller communities, is that they benefit from spatial and social proximity. So first of all, they understand, members of the community will tend to understand each other's constraints because they actually often have the same ones. But there's also more possibility of sort of real, genuine participation as opposed to just notional participating, and of maybe being able to come to some vision, whether it's a grand vision or a small vision of the future, which is more and more difficult the larger the community gets. So, for example, a community can't alter climate change, but could decide to revegetate a coastline, to build or not build on floodplains, to assist members who've been affected by a disaster, or they could choose not to tidy up after storms, to maintain their local infrastructure, a whole bunch of little things, which, if it's guided by some longer term vision, could actually amount to something. And one of the important things about thinking about the future is to also identify areas of action and see what they can add up to. So it's not just, because if we just think about each of those individually, it's just a one-off, short-termism. But then how can we sort of put this into a larger, these areas of action into a larger framework? So why would a community think about the future? It's as a guide. We have all these little things that can be done, but what is the destination? I mean, there's, in a way, there's sort of two possibilities. Say you're out on a road trip. One possibility is just to take each turning as it comes, and you don't really know where you're heading. You just take it going to the left, to the right. You may see some wonderful countryside, but you may end up nowhere as well. You may end up where you started. So, I mean, there are maybe some reasons for that, but there are other reasons why maybe having a destination, knowing where you're heading, will then help you to decide. So you get to a fork in the road, say, well, actually, I am heading, to Anse Meadows, so I need to turn right rather than left. And it's a small decision, turning right rather than left at a junction. But if you know where you're heading, then it helps you to make that decision. So having a vision, having a view of the future helps to back away from a fixation on immediate issues. And it helps to envision where the community would like to be or wants to be or can be. The other thing the community needs to, or everybody needs to realize, is that whether or not we thought about the future is coming. I mean, there will be a future. The real question is, to what extent can we have any influence over it altogether? So given all these constraints, what are the community's aspirations, and can anything be done to realize them? So it is constrained. I think we ought to be very careful not to sort of think or not to sort of portray future planning as some ideal that will solve everything. No, it provides a guide, provides some sort of destination, and helps us to make short-term decisions. One thing to be aware of before I quickly go over what I mean by visioning and scenario building is that a lot of work on future thinking comes out of management. There's been a lot of work, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s about future thinking for private firms. I've read quite a bit of it, and some of the techniques are similar, but there are fundamental differences. One of them is that the goals that firms set themselves are pretty much profit or market share. There's, so whatever else happens, those are the two goals, where the community can have a whole variety of different sorts of goals. What values does the firm enshrine? Well, even if the employees may have some say, ultimately the boss decides. And I know that many bosses will say, no, that's not the case. I just don't believe you. It's just not that you're the boss for a reason, and I'm not criticizing it, but also let's be realistic. In a community, although sometimes there are some strong meds and strong personalities who think that they can impose values, the fact is that's not the way communities function. And if they do, they're often dysfunctional communities. Dissenters can just get kicked out of the firm or ignored. In a community, they are there. They are members of the community. And unless they choose to move away, they somehow have to be taken into account as well. And the way that decisions are taken in a firm, again, there's a backstop. You may want to see consensus, you may want to have participatory running of the firm, but ultimately there is a boss or a manager who will make decisions. In a community, you really, particularly when you think about the future, you need some sort of consensus type or quasi-consensus seeking. So visioning. Visioning involves the community asking itself where it wants to be in the future, what its values and aspirations are, and crucially, once that's been sorted out, what first steps should be taken towards this future. So in order for to envision the desired future, you have to have a long time horizon. If you fix a 1 or 2 year time horizon, people will still be thinking in the short term. So visioning has to be on the 15, 20 or 25 year time horizon. Of course, it's unrealistic. We're not predicting, but we are envisioning where would the community want to be in 20 or 25 years. And the reason for that time horizon is to get away from short-termism. And then there's a process. There needs to be a process which is facilitated, and I'm not going to go into the details. First of all, there are people who have more experience than I have, but there's a process to elicit and discuss visions of the future. This is a divergent process where a lot of ideas are jumbled up, after which you then need to converge. You need to then begin to say, okay, we have all these ideas, which ideas are shared by a number of people, which ideas are clearly impractical, and then you begin to converge on the set of values, on the type of community, on the aspirations, and on what really people want for the community. Once that's been done, the next step is very practical. You now have a vision, a destination. Well, what are your first steps? So I may want to get to Onslow Meadows, but what is the first road I take when I leave the car park? Do I go up Signal Hill or down? Well, I will go down because that's where I know I'm heading to Onslow Meadows. But if I didn't know, then I'll toss a coin. So this is what the vision helps you to do, to make that sort of decision at every fork in the road that you come to, and you have to start somewhere. You start with the first fork in the road. It's practical. You have to think about the existing available resources. You have to have a reasonable timescale for these first steps. I'm not saying for the whole vision, but these first steps towards the vision need to have a timeline to them. And you need to start thinking about second steps. And needless to say, this then becomes it's the process, because once you've taken the first steps and the situation has changed, you need to revisit. And so this is why visioning, we sometimes think about the visioning exercise, which sounds like a one-off. Ideally, this is a recurring exercise. So as you move along, you can change destinations, the situation around you may have changed, different constraints, different opportunities arise. So once you have a destination, that's not the end, that is the beginning that helps you make those first decisions. So, and even if there is no agreement, you can identify, can some common first steps be identified? Can you understand why there's no agreement? That would also be a good a good way forward. Ideally, the first steps will require few or existing resources, and you have to have a monitoring process to discuss second steps. So I won't go over that. This is sort of more or less repeating what I've said, and I know that time is running short. So visioning is a process. It requires facilitation. It's difficult for a community to do this by themselves. I mean, they may, but very often it's a skill. Facilitating this thinking about the future is a skill that some people are better at than others. And so it can be useful, or very useful for it to be facilitated. It's a process. It is not a one-off. And in the way that I've described visioning, the constraints are not front and center. And this is a big difference with scenarios. You don't think about the constraints first. You think about what you want. But the constraints will emerge. They'll either emerge during discussion. Once we've had all that divergent thinking and we begin to converge, the people around the table will begin to identify some of the constraints. And if at that point they're not identified, well, when you start thinking about first steps, well, hang on, well, can we really do that? And so the constraints will emerge. And there is some criticism of visioning techniques saying this is pie in the sky, this is just sort of wishful thinking. The first part is, and that's good. And then there's a convergent thinking, and then there's the first steps, and at which point it begins to become very practical. And if there are constraints, they will emerge. So, and if no shared vision emerges, then that may be also a point of discussion. So, yes, there is that critique, but I think that it's possible to circumvent that. The second approach, and I will try to wrap up quickly as I can, is scenario building, which resembles visioning, but is in fact quite different. Scenario building tries to work out a range of possible future, tries to work out which actions and events lead to which futures, and what is the effect of possible but uncertain events. And these events can be within the community, or they could be outside events that may or may not happen, and what effect would they have. Once you've thought about the various actions that can be taken or policies that can be implemented, about the various possible events, and about the ongoing material processes like global warming that we know about, you can then set up a series of scenarios. And the scenario is basically a combination of events and actions, and some of which are more probable, some of which are less probable, some of which are more desirable, some of which are less desirable. And obviously, at one level, there's an infinite number of scenarios, and so there has to be some thinking involved to get credible scenarios, to have internal consistency, and to have some which are desirable, or maybe some which represent things that absolutely need to be avoided. So given the plausibility of each scenario and given the cost of benefits of each scenario, then choices have to be made. So which one should guide our decisions? And guiding a decision can be either a positive guidance, we want to move towards that scenario, or it could be a negative one. We absolutely want to avoid that possible scenario. So, and in both cases, then you start thinking about what are the steps that need to be taken to begin going towards one scenario or avoiding another one. And this is quite a classic sort of description of, or portrayal, I should say, of the range of sort of scenarios. You have sort of possible futures, which are possible but unlikely. Then you have plausible ones, which do actually stand some realistic chance of occurring. And then you have probable ones. These are the most likely scenarios. And then amongst those, you have some that you prefer and some that you don't. And as time goes on, the range of scenarios, range of possibilities gets wider. So this is a very classic portrayal of what scenarios are. So again, I'll go over that in more, I won't go over that in detail. I'm trying to wrap up. So I now bring it back and towards the end now to that picture I showed you of how we conceptualize time. Now we can fit visioning and scenario building into this view. So, well, you know, I mean, this may sound like science fiction, may sound rather wild, but actually visioning and scenario building fit into this scheme of thinking. So first of all, we'll leave the past to one side. We'll just focus on the present and the future. And visioning. So visioning, it starts by envisioning a desired future which will guide decisions today. So visioning starts with the future. So it starts right over to the right of this circle. It envisions the future. And the second step is it thinks about ways of attaining the envisioned future. So it goes from the future to the present and then thinks, how do we get from the present to the future? Whereas scenario building, it actually starts with actions and events which lead to different futures. So you start in the present, you say, here are all the possibilities, here are the various policies, decisions, events that can occur. What are the futures that these can lead to? So you start in the present, you go towards the future, or towards futures in this case. You then focus in on the scenario or these scenarios that you prefer or want to avoid. And then you say, all right, now that we have worked out how we move from the present to the future, let's now come back to the present and see how we can, what choices, what policies we have to make. So in a way, scenario building starts with the present, moves to the future, then comes back. Whereas visioning starts with the future, comes back to the present, and then moves back to the future again. And it may take you some time to digest, but this really, as I've been thinking about it, this has been the key difference between scenario building and visioning. And in some of the books I've read, there's tension between these two approaches. Some people really prefer one, some people prefer the other, and they're often presented as two entirely disconnected things. I actually think they're two rather different places to step in to future thinking. Okay, there are a lot of practical guides, and here's a few references. To conclude, so what can future thinking contribute? Well, first of all, it helps to encourage a constructive and collective way of thinking about the future. I mentioned the competing futures, the cacophony of futures. Really, you know, you need to have some agreement on where we're heading. Otherwise, as a society or as a community, we won't head anywhere. So I think that it helps to enable this constructive and collective way of thinking about it. It's also a structured way. I haven't been into all the facilitating techniques, but you know, this is quite a structured way. There are ways of creating visions. There are ways of building scenarios, and these are very useful tools to help communities think about the future. Think about the future can empower communities because there are things that can be done locally, and you mustn't forget realism. And realism is actually baked in. It is not crystal ball gazing, as I first thought a few years ago. Realism is baked in. There are material realities. These have not been ignored in my talk, and they are not ignored by people working on visioning or scenario building. So future thinking will not make the cod come back. So I think this is something which, if you're hoping for that, it ain't going to happen. But future thinking can help articulate aspirations, start discussions about the future, help communities identify where they can act, and can connect immediate decisions with long-term consequences. And that is the end of my talk.
Okay, we have about half an hour for questions. So who wants to go first? And I have like a dozen, so no problem if you don't have any. Questions? And anybody listening online, you can post in Q&A and I'll check with Kathy to see if we have any. No questions? Okay, I'll go. I have questions. You referred to quasi-consensus as a way of making decisions in communities. Why quasi?
Because I don't actually think that complete consensus is possible or workable. It's not possible because there's always going to be some disagreement, and it's not workable because it allows one individual or small group to dig in their heels and prevent anything from happening. So I think that you cannot hope or expect or even aim for consensus, but you do want some form of general agreement.
Can we have it for a moment?
Question is going to Pat Curran. So hi, Pat. I'd be interested in Richard's thinking on scale of planning. Should we be considering communities or regions? That's the million-dollar question here, isn't it? Or to use Alvin Sims and David Freshwater and Kelly Biden's thinking, functional regions.
Right. I think that that's a very interesting question, but my answer is not a cop-out. I think that it's actually how future thinking works. It actually works, it's multi-scalar. So you can think of the future at the scale of your neighborhood or your small community. It doesn't mean you should not think about it at the scale of the region. And then the question is, well, is it the administrative region or the functional region? Now, because they're about the same scale, then it becomes a question of where can decisions be made. And unfortunately, these days, it's the administrative region. It may not be the best scale, but that's the least decisions can be taken at that level and policies can be implemented. Functional regions are an economist's dream, but they have no sort of meaning in the policy world. And to take the two levels that I have mentioned, I think that, you know, I've basically gone from the global to the community. I haven't looked at anything in between. But there needs to be some future thinking at the global level, and right now it's missing. And honestly, I wish I had an answer to that, but I don't. But it doesn't obviate the need to actually think about the future at the community level. And I think that at least at the community level, things can more easily be done. I mentioned that communities are under the radar. There's actually a lot of degrees of freedom that communities have, which are just absent at the global level because there are so many powerful actors, each with their own interests. At the community level, I'm not saying there aren't powerful actors, but often people know each other, there's spatial proximity, there's a shared culture, there's a shared set of constraints, which means that thinking about the future, even though there are a lot of external constraints, is maybe somewhat more feasible at that scale. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about it at the higher scale. It's just that right now, you know, I've talked about gloomy modernism. I'm a bit gloomy about the prospects of some global future thinking.
Richard, I'm going to ask you an unfair question. I'm going to ask you not to be a planner.
Oh dear.
So going back to one of your other examples, I think the example you shared of the mining community, you know, that same example, you could probably find 10 or more here in Newfoundland today, you know, many communities around here would say, yeah, we know we got to make changes, but not yet. I would postulate that the reason some of that doesn't happen is more of a realm of efficacy. You have communities that say, well, there's not much we can do. It's not with that, we can plan for the future, but we don't control our future. So why bother? So the question, and for question is, can we talk a little bit about separating future things? I would also suggest that a lot of people in those communities are thinking about the future. So can we separate future thinking from planning practice, the more formal planning processes, and talk about the potential value? What do you see as the potential value of having, for lack of a better way of saying it, future thinking conversations in communities that aren't tied necessarily to coming up with a plan? Does that make sense?
I'll try and answer, and then we'll. Okay, so I have mentioned that future thinking can identify areas of action and a possibility. The unfortunate reality is that future thinking can also identify the fact that nothing can be done. And that there are occasions where that needs to be recognized. But even then, recognizing it collectively, rather than each person recognizing it alone and feeling isolated and powerless, if it's recognized as a group, then even the winding down of communities takes some thinking about the future. So I think that, first of all, there are probably more possibilities than is often realized in communities, but one mustn't or one shouldn't ignore the fact that sometimes really communities are destined to close. I mean, some of these mining communities I mentioned, or forestry communities in Quebec, were on the point of closing. Some even voted to close. I'm thinking of Murdochville, and it was been kept artificially alive because the Quebec government doesn't want communities to close. But they had actually collectively come to that decision. But I would say that is also future thinking.
How would you suggest somebody get involved in the future of the community?
Right. I think that it's well, first of all, it will very much depend on each community and the person's networks. But I think that, first of all, talking about it to see if there's some sort of general interest is one initial way. But to go beyond that point, I did mention the importance of facilitation, of trying to do it in a somewhat formal way. So you can do it informally, and I think that's really important. To just talking about the future, and often people, particularly when the future looks bleak, prefer not to. And this can then lead into a spiral of sort of silence and there's not talking sometimes about the obvious, such as there's no more trees in the wood and we rely on our sawmill, So talk about it, number one. But then if to move to the next step where there's really some attempt to have a collective vision, you need to get people together who are not just part of your individual network. And there's some sort of facilitating, I would say, is very useful.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, you're talking about the visioning and scenario building. So I guess who is doing visioning, scenario building? Who's leading it, and what are they going to do with it when it's done? And how does that, because I'm just thinking about like my experience here in the city, sort of interested in how we plan to develop our city over the last 30 years. Maybe we can paper the walls in here with all the plans and minutes of meetings and everything, that if you don't have a political sort of buy-in to the planning process, or maybe have lip service, that's one of the fundamental challenges, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think I think that there's two things. First of all, it's in a way partly because I've come up against sort of problems that you're coming up against, that I've been trying to think about it, because there are an infinity of plans, what I call a cacophony of futures, but there hasn't been much attempt to think about the future from a wider perspective. So I don't know about St. John's, but I certainly can talk for Montreal, where we have a whole series of plans for cycling, plans for parks, plans for clearing up the streets, plans for new jobs. But there's very little, there is no vision coming out either of the town hall or indeed of any of the community organizations which are there to say, well, okay, where do we really see Montreal in 30 years' time? What values do we want to sort of project? Because those, and very often that sort of thinking, you think, well, that's sort of blue sky thinking, that's usually, it's not practical. But it's precisely because it's not practical that we need to think about it, because then that will guide practice. And what's missing, I think, is this high level thinking about the future, within which then we can fit all these sort of micro plans. I think that's one of the things. The other thing is that planning or thinking about the future is not a one-off, because you saw that in the center of my little graph, there's always the present, but the present is always changing. And so in a way that what we need is it to become part of, talk about municipalities, part of municipal administration, to, as a matter of course, they propose a budget every year, to sort of propose an update on sort of where the vision is heading. At each election, there can be a proper discussion about the vision. But this sort of thinking is just not present at all. It was, I would say, in the from the 50s to the 70s, it was implicit. And the implication, the implicit thinking was suburbs, cars, a house for all. And we may not retrospectively think it was a great vision, but that vision was guiding a lot of decisions. And right now, we just don't have any vision anymore.
I can offer a response to the previous question real quick, how to get involved. So obviously, Richard kind of said this, a lot of it depends on the context, what depends on your community, the size of the community, what's already happening. But a couple of suggestions, there's lots of examples of just starting to have the conversation, particularly increasing emphasis these days on intergenerational conversations. So if you have a conversation with around the kitchen table or the coffee shop or wherever it might be, find someone who's been in that community for a while and start chatting with them and say, well, what was your vision for what did you hope for this community when you were my age? And here's what I'm seeing, and what do you think? So there's lots of tools out there. Actually, usually involved in generating some sort of interview guides we use for intergenerational sort of interviewing for those. So that's one. The second thing I would encourage is in your community, try to understand not necessarily who the visible leaders are, but the informal leaders. Who are the ones that are engaged in getting some things done, and chat with them a little bit about what they're trying to do. So those are just two quick steps. And if I may, Richard, one thing I'd also encourage, maybe it relates to another, one tool that might also be a link between the scenario planning and also the visioning is, at least this was the attempt for many folks around the community indicators. So the idea is, if in the case of visioning, you come up with what your vision is, then how do we know over time if we're getting closer to that vision? And then come up with a set of metrics that you're then tracing, and then if done as intended, you'd come back periodically and revisit those as you suggest. Are we getting closer? Are we getting further away? And inevitably, you're also revisiting the vision itself. Is this really what we're trying to get to? The indicators also come in on the scenario side because, as you noted in one of your diagrams, scenario, one of the critical things with scenarios is to say, what are those key causal sort of turning points for some of these scenarios? If something starts to happen here, we know we're going to go down that scenario path versus that scenario path. So it's an interesting possibility, and invite you to sort of look more closely. I don't know if many places have done it well, but that for many places was the intent to sort of have these community indicator systems allow to be that bridge, if you will, for a constant sort of feedback.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, we'll go on to the next question. I just wanted to offer maybe something hopeful. I facilitate a lot of community conversations around where we want to go in the future. The communities are really eager to have those conversations. What they don't have is somebody giving them space, time, and in some ways permission to have those conversations. So when we show up, and Chris and I worked together for a long time, that's why I keep organizing. When we show up and we tell them we have a day to talk about what would you like to see, but nothing concrete has to come out of it, it really changes the conversation.
I'm almost trying to say that I am a town planner and I do town plans all across the province. And I work under the Urban and Rural Planning Act. So when I arrive in a town, I have to comply with the requirements of the act. These communities only deal with this formal process probably once every 10 years. And so they're sort of stunned when I say, well, we need a vision of where we're going, right? And so then how do you try to get that conversation going? Usually with the councils, I can warm them up and deal with them, they'll bring in people to actually participate. A lot of the times when you have public consultations, you're talking about people in the community coming forward. They don't want to necessarily talk in front of each other. So you spend a lot of time going around the community, talking to people, then you understand that community, pull it together, it goes into the plan. And then what you do is you develop a plan that identifies their opportunities for the future that they envisioned, that they kind of accidentally suggested. So that goes on to a land use plan that has all the opportunities, at least made available to them. What doesn't happen though, is there is no formal way for them to action and for it to actually come about. And I do find that some of the communities that are more successful in taking that plan and making it work for them are the ones that actually do strategic plans on sort of a semi-annual basis or even every 2 years. But that strategic action plan or strategic plan then fits in. Like, so they make all of these different plans fit together and they take the discussion that you guys are having where people sit around the room and say, well, this is what's important to us now, and then they fit it into a structure that allows them to make decisions.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, town planning is a challenge because it is so regimented, as you say, and doesn't have any, well, it's very periodic. I mean, I think Montreal, we still have a 10-year-old plan or something. It's,
my question is, because you mentioned there should be sort of facilitation. My question is, who will do that facilitation? And when we're talking about a facilitation, there is a kind of power dynamic issue that could really influence the envisioning or scenario building or whatever. How you could address that power dynamic that could exist within local community, depending based on different factors. How to make sure that the power dynamic within the local community doesn't influence that envisioning and scenario building, and it will have the equal transfer opportunity to take part into the decision-making process. And how that would be different from other large-scale decision-making, because the same with large-scale decision-making processes, I think the power dynamic still is a challenge within the local context as well.
I mean,
the second question would be the participation. Could you please just explain how participation within that context could improve, how we can empower the local community to participate? So what would be the actual factor behind improving participation within the local community?
yeah, I'll give a quick answer, then I'll allow Boyan and Chris, because I'm sure they have a lot to say about this. My take is, first of all, there are always power dynamics. At whatever scale, whether you were talking about visionary master planners or participatory planners, there are always power dynamics. And in some communities, you just can't get around them. However, if you identify them, and this is where skilled facilitators are able to maybe identify them, to invite or to identify. Somebody spoke about the quiet decision makers. I think Chris spoke about that. You know, who are the people actually doing things who are maybe not so loud, who don't have such open power? And first of all, identifying them and then reaching out and trying to get them involved. Sometimes getting the powerful people involved, because if they're involved and they have to express themselves, and you know, sometimes this power is not always directly expressed in a community setting. Either it becomes obvious that there's a power problem, or that person has to revise their ambitions downwards because they're a bit embarrassed. So there are a number of ways that power can be addressed, but we cannot abstract from power in any policy making or future thinking or any context. That's part of who we are. And then the second, as a society, and what was the second?
how it improved the participation. We're talking about
Well,
this,
so-
visioning or scenario burning that improve the participation.
I mean, participation is itself always a problem. In smaller communities, it's maybe easier for people to know that something's happening. May also be easier to identify because you may not get everybody to participate, but at least people representing particular groups or communities or interests to make sure that at least you have representatives of a variety of points of view. But participation of everybody is very difficult. People don't have the time, people have responsibilities. There are many reasons, but at least to make an active effort, not just to sort of passively expect people to come, to reach out and at least to get key interest groups. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I mean, some interests or many interests are important to have there, but to have, or stakeholders, maybe the better word, to have key stakeholders or representatives of key stakeholders there so that these voices are heard. And now I'll hand it over to Chris and Boyan.
Maybe I'll start with a quick explanation and then pass to Chris. And we should wrap it up. So when we facilitate conversations in the community, we have 70 people show up. And Chris will talk about how we got them in that room in the first place. But one of the key facilitation points is that you offer different points of entry for everybody to enter the conversation. And we do that throughout the day. We make it some of the things you work on individually, some smaller group. There's a point where we work with the entire group. The other problem is that we, as a facilitator, you have to acknowledge the power that you have. So you cannot impose a conversation. You have to let them have the conversation that you have. But you can keep track of who's speaking, whose voices we are not hearing, and there are ways to gently draw those voices out. But you also have to be very careful not to allow people to stop the conversation they don't want to. And we have examples where somebody in the community wanted to talk about economic law. They didn't want to talk about somebody from a smaller community who felt that their identity is threatened by regionalization. So there's a whole bunch of little tricks we use in order to get people to feel that what happens in that room, they sort of.
So I no longer work with the hairdresser, so no, I'm not gonna say how we get people to go for it. But I would encourage, if you are ever in a situation where you're starting a process, I think you've asked a really good question around the power dynamics, but I would encourage you to break that down and think about, are we thinking about power dynamics within the community, which I would agree with Richard, that's always gonna be there. But most good facilitators, and there's many grades of facilitators, most good facilitators have the tools and experience and skills to be able to deal with power dynamics within communities and within those processes. There's ways to do that fairly effectively. I would encourage you also to think, and Boyan just touched on this, but it's something I think is pretty important, the power dynamics between the facilitator and the community discussion. And you need to be a very self-aware facilitator to understand, and that's, it's not a science, it's art, because you're there as a facilitator to help them have that discussion. So you're going to have power. How you exercise that power and how you engage people in that is, that's a little bit trickier. So that's a longer conversation. But both of those come into play. And we can talk later about more of that, but also the participation question I think is also tricky. I mean, there's no such thing as perfect participation. So, but there are different, as Boyan said, and Richard also said, there are different techniques that partly I was sort of getting at the planning side. Some people, you invite them to a planning discussion or even a visioning discussion. I got better things to do. Thank you very much. What if you wanted to show up and look at a piece of art or engage in some sort of activity where you're working on something? Then you had a discussion about, well, what was this all about? Some people are going to engage in those conversations through we used to have an analogy in a group I used to work with, the round barn. People are going to come in very different doors into the conversation. Once they're in there, you can have a conversation with them. But how you invite them in is going to matter in terms of that participation.
We have one more question, and if there are any other questions, we can take two. Now, one of the things in terms of tour announcement that Chris and I would do every time, we would say, I'm from Croatia, Chris is from Northern California. we are not experts in your. The only job we have is probably. So step back, that would be.
That was observation more, so I was about to do this exercise. It's supposed to be. And we have about 2,300. So I live there, I am not from there. Those of you who are Newfoundlanders will appreciate what that means. I've lived there for 4 years. I've taught at Memorial for the last 4 years in strategic planning, business and retired business. So my objective in this community session, I volunteered to do it for my community. And my objective was to bring a perspective, given various scenarios, on things that I know are important to people in that community. So land use development, of course, goes for the other key one, what are we doing about our seniors and what are we doing about our students? So we have a school that has very strong reputation. And so I've developed using the accounts database a profile of what will happen to the school and a profile of what can happen to the seniors so that I can talk to them on emotional issues currently for them and build a perspective based on the facts to take some of the emotion that Richard talked about out of the room, at least momentarily. I'm not done. Secondly, I'm expecting to do this presentation twice because not enough people will show up the first time. And hopefully it'll go well and people will say, more people need to see this. So before I do the first one, I'm expecting I'm going to do this. And that's just, for me, it was more about how can I take all of the things that I've seen over that 44 years as a consultant industry and strategic planning professor and so on, and bring all that together. So thank you, Richard, for refining my presentation in real time. That hour.
Any other questions? Anything online? No? Okay, I think we're done. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much for coming, yeah.
you.